Hello, everyone. My name is Rich, or awtnmy. I am the founder of a games company called Archetypal Tech. I've run a traditional game studio for just over 10 years, and now we're exploring fully on-chain games. So I'm here to tell you a few of the things that we've learned over the years making games moddable, and therefore what that can mean for composable games. So yeah, this is me. I started life welding sculpture nearly 2 decades ago. I then moved into visual effects for a few years, and in the late 2000s I started building video games professionally. Why are fully on-chain games interesting? Well, for me, having seen the kind of rise of what we call the golden era of indie gaming in 2008 to 2012, it maps really closely to what we had happen there, with an academic kind of underpinning being the starting point. In the early 2000s, there were a few people like Jesper Jules who came up with terms like ludology. Raf Costa underpinned a lot of this stuff, like the theory of fun and how to describe a problematic word like fun. But people weren't able to make games that actually made use of these theories very easily, because the engines you had access to were things like renderware. A license for it was 30 grand out the box. And it wasn't until we started to have Microsoft actually releasing something called the XNA framework, which was a freely available tool set for building to Xbox. And Unity in 2008 finally releasing a version of the Unity editor that could be run from a PC rather than just a Mac. And it was this kind of movement from academia into having tools that were maturing that started to spark really crazy and interesting things, games that would explore life, death and love. And we all know kind of Jonathan Blow and Braid and the kind of era that games that came out of that. And the final piece that comes with that is something I think we're all aware of, which is you need a market square, you need distribution in order to have players. And so we had Steam starting to open up the floodgates, we had the App Store come online, and we had Xbox Live Arcade be somewhere where indie game developers could actually start publishing games more freely. And for us in this kind of autonomous worlds, fully on-chain game space, we're kind of still in the kind of bald, bearded and bespectacled people talking about interesting ideas while the technology starts to get ready to underpin those things being made into really, truly interesting experiences. And it's kind of fortuitous that I'm sandwiched on this schedule between two of the developers whose tools are pushing that boundary, and that we've had the good fortune to work with both. So that's the World Engine, obviously, as you saw with Scott, and then you've got Terrence talking about Dojo, which is a fantastic tool set that we're working with now as well. But that means that on the scale of things, we're maybe only a third of the way into reaching a potential golden era for fully on-chain games. And so expectations for that, I think, need to be set in that kind of framing. So I've got quite a lot of depth in this session, and I may have to speed run some of it, so we'll skip over some bits here and there. But I'm meant to be coming here to tell you about how to build compelling, moddable, and therefore composable games. And the fundamental thing with me in the kind of decade running a studio, I found is that games are dialogue, not diatribe. So they're a two-way conversation with your players. They're very much different to film. Authorship, I think, can exist in games, but you need to put something out there and let players talk back to you with it. And so one of the interesting things that I like to dive into when we're talking about modability is a notion of deep games. So there's quite a kind of broad category that this kind of covers. A lot of the time it takes into account simulative games or deep systems. And we all know that kind of that takes its form in military and strategy games, but also other creative such things, you know, whether it's city builders or The Sims. The process for making a deep game in the past would have been to define your strategy mechanics or the simulative mechanics that you were going to build with, and then find an interesting period of time or genre or setting that would make for engaging tactical choices, and then iterate through that. If it's a historical game, you'd end up reading a lot of history books. And you'd probably end up bringing in a historian or even a team of researchers to help ensure accuracy and have them fight your design team to death because of conflicts of outlook. And then you build a game around this history and ship it to players. But 10 to 15 years ago, there was a kind of revolution in moddable games, and we all know kind of the Minecraft and Roblox stories, but there's a lot more to it. The same thing was occurring across many different types of games. And I always like to cite Kerbal Space Program as one of these. Kerbal was actually a relatively dull game when it first launched, but they did something really interesting. They used the Unity editor in order to ship a free and easily accessible tool set to their players, and they dumped almost their entire tooling that they used as a dev team into something that was easily accessible by their fans. And the outcome that had was you no longer needed to employ a historian or an expert. It effectively attracted people who gravitated, for lack of a better word, towards astrophysics and helping improve what a moonshot should be. And so that kind of process is important to actually mimic across all moddable games. And if we talk about something like Minecraft, the same thing occurs there. The deepest and most interesting things in those moddable worlds and universes is often deep experts coming and doing something very niche in an intense fashion. We have city skylines there, people who love trying to do traffic management in new and interesting ways. It makes for an incredibly in-depth and saturated world. So how do they get there? Well, there's this important thought around game design lenses, and something that I think that the fully on-chain game space is starting to really grapple with now that they've started to get a sense around what the tech can do and where they're taking it. And it's important to apply some form of design lens, one of my favorites being aesthetics. The other thing that they need to do for making a game moddable is curated systems access, or APIs. So your game isn't just moddable when it's fully on-chain purely because you've open sourced the code base. We've been able to reverse and deserialize binaries for decades, and that didn't necessarily make for moddable games before. So I'll skip over the taxonomy of aesthetics in any particular depth. There's a deep article that I've written about this stuff, and I've actually got some physical versions of a zine that Achilles and Baz from Tonk and some of the Playmate guys contributed to, that if anyone's interested in digging into this depth, I'll hand out a couple of copies. But the reason for thinking about aesthetics is because we want to talk about what it means to imbue a sense of feeling upon a player, and you need to find words that help you describe something like fun in more depth. And an easier way of kind of coming around this, and it's really nice actually following on from Achilles' talk earlier, because I think there's a lot of overlap with what he was talking about, the production of objects. But fundamentally, an aesthetic object generates an aesthetic experience for an aesthetic recipient. And what do I mean by that? Well, effectively, truth, goodness, and beauty occurs when you shape an object that has some form of aesthetic to it. And aesthetic, as we saw in the taxonomy, it doesn't mean how something just looks. We think of aesthetics as a general purpose word for something that looks nice, but it's actually about depth and feeling and sentiment, the power of nature, a feeling you can give to someone, wilderness. So that's one of the lenses that you can jump into as a game designer, and for making a moddable game, it's incredibly important to get right. And there is a system that you can apply to your system here. Again, you can have a deeper look in the article, and I'll skip through this a little faster, but the MDA approach is really important. It's a way of assessing the aesthetics of something that has systems underneath and the dynamics that help them to occur. And it's a way of describing fun. You know, we all kind of recognize that a game has rules. Those rules are turned into systems, and we expect the output to be fun for the player. The most important thing, though, is not as a games developer to only think about it from the mechanical end, which we're used to tweaking and playing with, but to constantly switch your perspective so that you're looking at your user's set of lenses, which is the aesthetic experience that they're having. Here's a taxonomy of fully on-chain games. It's a bit of a kind of do-your-own doodle graph. So in the book version, you get to sketch all over it as well. So modding is essentially the focusing of player instinct into your game. And if you're going to do that, you need to have an aesthetic that they vibe with, right? And I think, vibes is a word that gets used in this space quite thoroughly, and you can probably switch aesthetics out for the word vibes. But effectively, players will instinctively assess the immersion of any given game, and then they will look, if they like that feeling, to try and expand upon it, make it happen more regularly, or make it more intricate in various different ways. And so your job as a game developer making tools or games that are moddable is to allow for that in as many ways as possible. So to incentivize community contributions in a moddable game, we have to provide worlds that have identifiable aesthetics, right? So what is the vibe, and can a player describe it if you ask them? Then you have to have observable dynamics. How is this playing out in the world? What are the things that give a player vibes, and can they say how they were given them? And then granular and transparent mechanics. And the reason that we say granular and transparent is, for a game to be moddable, a player has to be able to recognize the systems that have parts that they could change. As I said, you can dig into some of this in more detail in this article. You can follow it and find it on our GitHub. And I've got some physical copies if you're interested. So there are key differences, though, between a game that is moddable and a game that is composable. So you need all of the above for it to be moddable. You need to have accessible game rules, an open code base of sorts, high-level language abstractions, and tooling that grants that kind of access, as well as very, very good documentation. Composability needs that and more. Composability needs strong and open-ended aesthetics that allow players from many different directions to get into them. Permissive licensing, and then it needs guided and curated open source code bases. So this is going to be a really hard one to speed run through, but we'll try and get to my 4 points on how you can go about making a moddable game and then a composable game in a compelling way. So ask 4 questions. Can you teach a beginner to mod your game? Can you make a tool set or even use existing tool sets that allow someone to just click a few buttons and change something in the game world? The easiest example being strings. Anyone who is playing a game can probably read the things on screen and knows how to write something interesting that might change it to their vibe. Can you teach an expert in the field to explore that subject matter in depth in a way that keeps them entertained? So we made a hacking game. Friends of mine in hacker culture came and made some interesting mods. Some people may know that Mustafa and I go a long way back before crypto stuff. And in 2017, one of our mutual friends made a Mus coin in one of the games that we were making. So 3, can you teach a group of complete strangers to use the tools with your guidance? Basically, we used to run workshops in interesting places and see whether we could actually run people through our documentation and our tools. And then can the wider internet learn to use the tools with just your documentation? And that's the biggest fundamental. After that, the question is, can you incentivize people to do something weird and wonderful? So this is a hacker conference called CCC Camp, and like in the kind of in the spirit of Celestia style things, actually Mustafa and Ishmael met at CC Camp in like 2016 or something along those lines. And that's where the Lazy Ledger paper sort of started, was a conversation there. But some of our fans of one of the hacking games that we made decided to build CCC Camp in one of the games. And actually one of them got it working on the Steam thing that looks like a Game Gear. What is that called? Anyway, the Steam thing. So what systems are important to open up to curate for modding? Well, control over narrative, right? Dialogue systems and events. Control over a core mechanic or the data and stats that drive it. So that's items, weapons, inventory effect. Control over a core obstacle or a puzzle system. So that's devices, gates, opponents. Control over the metagame itself. Mission scripting, objectives, progression, branching, and sort of narrative again as well. And then go further. There's many things that you can do after these 4, but you need those 4 first. So as an example of this, we have been making a text adventure game called the Orugan Trail. As I said, it's actually built across multiple different frameworks. We built it originally in Mud. We've done a port of it across to World Engine. And I actually realized, Terrence, I'm wearing some Dojo socks as well. So it's not just Argus swag here. And we can pretend that Lattice gave me some underwear or something, I suppose. So this is my quick video of the Orugan Trail, but the whole point is how can you take a blockchain game, a concept, and refine it down into something much simpler? What are its easiest core components that you can make composable in some way, shape, or form? Hopefully the video will play in a moment, but it doesn't matter too much if it doesn't. It's a very quick demo. It just shows literally a console input. And the whole point being is, like I said, you want the easiest thing for your players to change. And the easiest thing is language. And the most composable thing we have as humans is language. So the natural fit of an adventure game, it meets some of the things that we had Alex talk about earlier in terms of leaning into your kind of limitations and affordances, block time, etc., block latency. The point being, if you build something that is text-based and turn-based, then you're going to be okay, and you can make it moddable. And we took this principle a bit further, so we made it a game that you can actually write interactive fiction together in. So the world is a text map as well, so you can see on the bottom left here, we have an array that actually describes the worlds in this text adventure, and anyone can add and edit them. So you can make your own 4x4 world, literally by putting the characters XXX next to each other to describe a path that runs to the east. Then P is for portal, that's a door into C, which is a cabin or building. P next to it is another portal or window, and then X is a path out. Those are rooms or objects. They can have objects put within them, which are directional objects that fulfill puzzles, and items for inventory, and all of this can be tied together with story. So players have direct control over this world in text. And then you can fairly quickly build some Rust tooling to make that stuff easier so that people aren't redeploying smart contracts or having to write in Solidity or whatever else paradigm-wise. So to go back to our 4 points, effectively you have user-generated rooms and descriptions, so control over narrative. User-generated inventory items and behaviors, so control over a core mechanic or data or stats that drive them. User-generated behaviors, that's control over a core obstacle, doors or puzzle systems. And then you have control over the metagame with those maps, those worlds, and the narrative and progression that players can actually create for each other. So I'm close to finishing up here now, and I think I'm pretty much on time, which is nice. So this is where composability sets itself apart. Once you start to break these things down into the simplest core components and you work with your affordances, you can start to make games that join into other games, games that are bridges between games, games that bridge worlds and communities together, games that start to make use of the fact that you have a blockchain and mods that have natural payment rails built into themselves so that players can start to mess around with emergent markets and things like that. We have a small example here of, there's a game called This Cursed Machine on Redstone, built in Mud, and the original version of Orugan Trail was developed in Mud. So we looked at composability where we could set a factory into the Orugan Trail, and then that factory would send orders over dynamically to players in This Cursed Machine, which means you have a natural moderation of difficulty and new challenges that can be shipped between two different distinct player communities, playing different games but affecting each other. So if you get these principles for modding right, you'll have a good shot at seeing the fruits of composability. Players who are then inspired to add to the culture of a game, and they'll end up in turn adjusting or adding new ways to monetize within the game for you, because that's what a blockchain allows for, right? So there's this idea that markets can emerge effectively. We need to not think so much about making the perfect economy for a game or imposing a market upon a game, but allowing for interesting realms and worlds where those markets and games and economies can emerge. So the TLDR is make a game compelling with an aesthetic focus, because you need to draw people who are going to be inspired into doing those things. Curate the composability in a given game, and then just let the open core game rules that are fully on chain, paired with embedded payment rails that a blockchain gives you out the box, do the rest. That's it, really. So I've got probably very little time, but if there is any burning questions, you can either throw them at me quickly now or grab me off the stage afterwards. But thank you very much.